Hello and welcome to UWO Now. I'm your host, Wendell Ray. UWO Now is a place where we talk to students, staff, and faculty at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh about interesting and relevant topics. Well, this topic is in the news almost every day and has been for more than a year. You feel it when you go to the grocery store or when you purchase products or services. I'm talking about inflation. But what is it? What is inflation? When will it go away? And will these prices that we're experiencing now be permanent? Here to kind of break it down for us today is David Fuller, who is a professor of economics at the College of Business here at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. Thanks so much for coming by and talking to us today on UWO Now.
All right. Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So for an economist, this is a great time. You know, you get to see all this dynamic stuff going on and teaching it as it's happening. But for most folks, we hear about inflation. We see what's happening in terms of how it impacts our wallet, our pocketbook, what we pay for products, as I mentioned, or going to the grocery store. But can you tell us, Professor, what is inflation?
Sure. Well, it's a great question, actually. So I'll kind of break it into two parts. So, well, the easiest definition is inflation is a general increase in prices. Okay, so when you mentioned, the things we're paying for, go to the gas station, you go to the grocery store, things are more expensive. So if average prices are going up, that's what we call inflation. So I'll just give a little more detail to that. So in economics, we like to break it into, there's something we call relative prices, which would be compare the price of a gallon of milk to the price of my orange juice.
Okay.
Right? So that's a relative price. How expensive is
Gotcha.
milk compared to orange juice? And based on those relative prices, that's how markets allocate goods and services across the economy. So I decide whether I'm going to, go out to eat at Chipotle versus cook something at home based on those relative prices.
Gotcha.
Okay. Those are changing all the time. So the price of one good might go up, the price of another good might go down. Those are changes in relative prices. They're happening all the time. Mm-hmm. That's our economy doing its job, allocating resources where they should be. So then what can happen, and generally does happen over time, is all prices tend to go up. So the price of orange juice is going up and the price of milk are going up.
At one time?
At one time.
Okay.
Right? So that's what we mean by inflation, is that when I average out all the prices in our economy, those are going up more or less across the board. Now, there's still some that are going up faster than others, relative prices changing, but inflation is catching the idea that all prices are going up. In general, our cost of living is increasing.
Okay. Now, why? Why do prices go up around the same or at the same time? Now, let me just say this. Maybe, what does supply and demand have to do with that, or does that impact it? That is, there's more demand for a particular product. There's not enough of that product, so I'm going to charge more for that product. Is that a part of inflation, or does that have anything to do with inflation?
That definitely can play a role, right? So that's exactly right. So not to get too technical, right? But so if we go back to my milk example, and if demand for milk was to increase really quickly, that's going to tend to push the price of milk up, right? So in general, if that's kind of happening across the economy, it's going to tend to move prices up or push prices up. Now we get to the question of, why is that kind of happening across the economy? Why is demand moving in such a way to increase prices across the economy? And I think I kind of break it into two different views of inflation. One is we can think of over longer periods of time, how much inflation does our economy have? So historically in the U.S., we have relatively low inflation. So we've had periods, back in the 1970s, we had relatively high inflation, higher than we have today. That kind of continued into the early 80s, and now we have a bit of an inflationary period now. But, on the whole, inflation has been around 2 to 3% if we average it out. If you compare to other countries, there's other countries that have had a much higher sort of average inflation rate over a similar period of time. So then I try to figure out, what is the why does one country have lower inflation than another country? That comes down to basically how much money is being created in the economy.
Created by businesses and industries, employment created. What do you mean when you say how?
By
money
created, I mean to make it simple is basically how much money do we print? How much new money do we print?
Okay.
So every country, most countries have what we call a central bank. Our central bank is the Federal Reserve Bank,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
right? And so among the many things that they do, they sort of have a finger on how quickly the quantity of money that's flowing around in our economy is increasing. So depending on their actions, they can sort of put more money into the economy. They can take some money out.
And we're talking about physically printing money. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, to some sense, yeah, it is right. I mean, some of it is just physically printing cash. And certainly, further back in the economy, that's exactly what we were talking about.
Okay.
Today, more and more transactions happen electronically. So, a lot of the money creation is flicking computer keys. And
Understood. Okay.
adding money to balances that banks have with the Federal Reserve is kind of how they do it. But I think the analogy works great. Just imagine that, the Federal Reserve prints a bunch of cash and starts handing it out across the economy.
Okay.
Right. So
making it available.
Making it available.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
And so, that does a lot of things. Then banks start making loans. You're buying more cars, houses. And so that kind of drives that process that pushes prices up.
Okay.
And so when I compare countries across time and the average inflation rate, that's the biggest factor. That's what causes long-term inflation is the central bank printing more money than the economy can handle.
So if I'm out there listening, I'm like, okay, why are they doing that? If they know that this can happen, why would they do that?
Yeah. So in most countries that suffer, and we've been lucky, in the United States, we haven't really gone down that path of printing so much money that we get runaway inflation for long periods of time. Why does a central bank do that? Is typically to pay off government debt that they just got stuck and they can't raise enough tax revenue to pay it off. They're not able to borrow more money to finance their previous obligations. And so the last ditch solution is the central bank prints some extra money, basically gives it to the government. They use that to pay the bills, and then we're off and running. So,
is that what happened with us?
No,
in the United States. Okay, not. All right.
So luckily, yeah, we're not in a. I'm sure, and I don't want to get into the politics of of the government debts and all that stuff. But obviously, it's been increasing, but not so much that anyone's concerned that the U.S. government can pay it off. So, U.S. government is still able to borrow more money if they need to, and so we haven't got to the point where the Federal Reserve has to print money to pay off our debts. If we did, then we'd really have an inflation problem. This inflation problem today, why did all our prices go up? That's why I mentioned the long term. It's a slightly different case than that because like in the 70s, you get these things that just sort of push the economy in this direction, and then we can take action and bring it back down pretty quickly to where we're typically at.
Okay, you talk about push. There's different types of inflation, right? There's push.
Cost push you're thinking of.
Yeah, going demand pull. Going back to my macro class in college. Okay, so which one? And again, we're not trying to get too deep in the weeds, but I heard you mention push. Are we talking about that type of inflation?
Yeah, I think we're in a combination. Yeah, so that's awesome that you remembered that. So whoever you had for economics is happy somewhere.
Yeah.
So one type of inflation is what we call cost push,
which means,
and basically what that is the cost of doing business. And so typically this is energy costs go up, and so because I'm a business and my my energy costs and costs of doing business are going up, I have to increase my price in response. If that happens to all businesses, it pushed prices up because my cost of doing business is going up.
And I push that along to the people who are
and
buying
I pushed that along to the people buying my products. So that's what happened in the 1970s. We had this big oil price shock, drove up the price of oil, energy, and so businesses had no choice but to increase their prices and pass that along to consumers.
So that is one of the reasons we always are hearing about, ladies and gentlemen out there listening, we're paying attention to oil prices and why that is an leading indicator of maybe why we may end up having higher prices elsewhere.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's and again, I'm trying to just break it down simply, but I keep running into these economic terms. So I mentioned a leading indicator, which is...
Well, a leading indicator is something that changes before it
hits everything else. Right?
Yeah. So if I'm talking about inflation, I'm looking for a leading indicator is something that moves up before inflation does and gives me a signal that inflation could be increasing in the future.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So now let's go back to us here in the United States. We've got an understanding of how inflation may occur in other countries. Right now, we're experiencing a period of inflation, and I want to ask what long-term means down the road in a second. But what are economists saying is the reason we are experiencing higher costs, higher prices now? Is it because of an infusion of capital into the system, more money? There's a low unemployment. People have maybe more money to spend. There's more, as I mentioned, demand is higher. We were talking about oil prices. COVID may have had an impact. What are people saying has driven this period of inflation?
Yeah, all of the above.
Oh.
So,
okay.
So I think it's really a combination of factors. So, I mean, first, we go back to the increase in money growth, money creation by the Federal Reserve Bank. That did happen post-COVID or in the period of COVID. So now that's exceptional, and I think everyone would agree that the Federal Reserve was very well justified in keeping the economy afloat in this unprecedented time that we had, right? So one of the things they did to help the financial sector, to help banks and everyone keep operating, was they printed a lot of money and made it available to banks. That helped a lot.
And they had to do that because people were at home. There wasn't a lot of business going on, or what?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay. So, once income, for a lot of people, you couldn't go to work, right? Mm-hmm. And so if I can't go to work, it's going to be difficult for me to get paid because my firm can't earn revenue. So if I was a restaurant and I'm initially closed down, I have absolutely no way to earn revenue, no way to pay my employees. Once my employees can't earn revenue or income, they can't pay their mortgage, for example. What are banks going to do at this point? And so the Federal Reserve, very wisely said, we're going to put a bunch of cash into the system, into banks, so that they can make loans to companies to help them stay afloat. Uh-huh. There was some of the government programs and those things that ran at that same time. And so that was the justification, and it made sense, and I think was we look back, we're happy that we had all those things.
Could have been a lot worse if we didn't make some of those moves.
Could have been a lot worse, yeah. We didn't have any major bank failures or anything during that time, which we certainly could have. But the consequence, part of what we're seeing now is that the money growth was so rapid in that period, it had to contribute to part of the inflation we see today. So that is definitely part of the story. And you can see the Federal Reserve now, and we can talk about that later, they're kind of unwinding what they did before, and that's what's helping to bring inflation down.
All right. You're listening to UWO Now. I'm your host, Wendell Ray, and today we're talking with Dr. David Fuller, a professor in the Department of Economics and the College of Business at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, trying to break down for everyone what inflation is. You hear about it, you know, you feel it when you go and buy things, but I don't get the sense that most people, quite honestly, most media people that I hear talking about it, most anchors and talk show hosts, they just are regurgitating what someone else said, but not really getting to the kernel of it. And what is inflation? Why are we experiencing it? How long might this last? Is this a permanent shift in pricing? And what about eggs? Why am I paying so much for a carton of eggs? We're going to talk about that at length here one other time here with Dr. Fuller. So you mentioned, Dr. Fuller, that during this period of COVID, when the economy was slowing down, people couldn't go to work, businesses were shuttering, and there were lots of things that were preventing this flow of capital, this flow of money in the economy. The Federal Reserve pumped some more money into the economy so that businesses can continue to operate. But there was also this issue of because of COVID, goods weren't flowing, and there was backups in docks on the coast, and there was all these ships lined up in shipping channels trying to deliver goods. They couldn't because other countries were experiencing COVID. They weren't producing. What impact did that have on the economy and what we're experiencing now?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And I think that's the other piece to the puzzle of where our current inflation comes from is, like you said, even once things returned to semi-normal in late 2020, 2021, there were still a lot of these shortages that people were noticing, right? So the various supply chain issues made it hard for companies to keep up with demand. So, we had the Federal Reserve took these unprecedented actions that kept the economy afloat. Once things turned around, they turned around really quickly and the economy grew very rapidly. Right, so it was kind of this V-shaped type issue that we had, that the economy tanked during COVID, and we popped back out, and it started growing really quickly. And so the unemployment rate went down.
So V-shaped, for those of you who can't see what he's doing, if you're looking at like a graph, you go down really fast, then you go up really fast, so it looks like a V on the graph.
Okay. Yep, that's right. And so the unemployment rate started going down quickly and has remained low. And so, as you said, so what that creates is people wanting to buy lots of goods and services. The economy is doing well. The unemployment rate is low. But because of these supply chain issues, it was hard for companies to manufacture and produce those goods and services fast enough to meet that demand. And so what happens if there's, excess demand, as we might call it, right? People want to buy more stuff than we can produce. That's going to push the price of goods and services up.
There goes that word again.
Or pull them up, I guess. This is more of
a pull. Okay.
More of a demand pull type of situation, right?
Cost
combination,
push, yeah. Demand pull.
Yeah, Yep, that's right. So if demand for goods and services increases much faster than what we can currently supply them at, that's going to tend to push most prices up across the economy.
Wow. So we got a soup of
we got everything.
Mixed vegetable soup of stuff going on that is causing a lot of angst for people out there. You're listening to UWO Now. Today's guest is Dr. David Fuller, who is a professor in the Department of Economics in the College of Business at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, here trying to help us all understand what this is we're experiencing called inflation. You hear it, you see it on the news, you hear economists talking about it, and people are debating what's causing it, and all you really want to know is why is it happening, and when is it going to end, and what do we have to do to make it go away? And Dr. Fuller is explaining to us what inflation is and how it happens, and we're going to continue that conversation with him about inflation. But first, I want to kind of take a step back and kind of ask you, Dr. Fuller, what's your path to UWO? How did you become a professor of economics here at UWO?
Yeah, good question. Well, I moved here from Montreal in Canada, actually.
Oh, nice, great city.
Yeah, beautiful city. So I was working there at a university called Concordia University, a different one than the local one here. So it's a bigger university there in Montreal. So yeah, I was working there as a professor of economics for a number of years, and I was actually born in Oshkosh.
Is that right?
Way back when.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I grew up in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, outside of Madison.
Yeah, know exactly where it is.
And yeah, so I went to UWO Clare as an undergraduate, and I felt really grateful to have benefited from the UW system. So I got a really low-cost, high-quality education, and that took me to some really cool places. I got to do some really cool stuff. I saw the job opening at UW Oshkosh. I said, I would like to get back to Wisconsin, be close to family, get a chance to contribute to the UW system, and that's what brought me back here. I've been here since 2014.
And your field of study, your area that you concentrate in, typically as in your dissertation and all your research, what area are we talking about?
Most broadly in macroeconomics.
Which I know what that means.
Oh, sure.
Macro
fair.
is,
Macro. Yeah, macroeconomics is concerned with the issues we're talking about today, which is the bigger picture of the economy. So inflation, economic growth, the business cycles. So we're looking at the economy as a whole. The other part of economics, microeconomics, looks at the individual units, right? So if, you mentioned before, if I want to know why did the price of eggs go up, in some sense, that's a question for microeconomics. Price of one good, I want to focus on micro. Macro is concerned with the bigger part of that, inflation, the price of all goods.
Okay. So that is what we've been talking about here, inflation, and really trying to help define it and to give our listeners a better understanding of what inflation really is, why it happens, when will it go away, and what is happening behind the scenes. So, you get bits and pieces of it that you may or may not understand what exactly inflation is all about. We've talked about demand pull, cost push inflation, which has to do with, we defined earlier, and there's too much demand for certain things, then that's going to pull prices up. Or cost push what was the definition of cost push again?
Cost push is when basically the cost of doing business, typically energy prices, goes up. That pushes up the cost of the goods the company's selling. So if I'm selling a good or a service and the cost of doing business goes up, I have to push along that cost increase in my price to consumers.
So we had maybe a mix of all that going on to get us to where we are today. Is that what you believe?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh, wow. So then we have, you mentioned when we first started talking about these central banks. We don't have a central bank, so to speak, in the United States. What we have here is the Federal Reserve, which is, ladies and gentlemen, if you hear the Federal Reserve come up on your news, this is why they're talking about them, because they are central to helping to manipulate the economy in such a way that inflation will slow, ease, and we get back to where we once maybe never were, but at least inflation stops growing at a fast rate. Right about that? Is that
that is correct? Yeah.
Okay.
So the Federal Reserve's main concern is inflation. So that's their main goal, and what they do is to maintain a relatively low inflation rate for our economy. So when the inflation rate goes up, the Federal Reserve is fully engaged, and they're saying we're going to take whatever actions are necessary to bring the inflation rate back down to the levels we find reasonable.
Okay. All right. So they will do things like raise interest rates, which will make people be less inclined to take out loans. So they kind of cool the economy, cool the demand a little bit that's out there to kind of steady the ship a little bit.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so when you hear, you've seen Federal Reserve has raised interest rates pretty much continuously since 2021, and pretty quickly, much faster than they had ever done in past history. And so that's exactly right. They're doing that to effectively, or they're doing it by pulling money out of the system. And that's exactly right, in the hopes that that sort of cools down the demand for goods and services that we see. So people are going to buy fewer houses, going to buy fewer cars, appliances, and that, cycles its way through the economy and means, in general, we're going to be buying fewer goods and services.
And housing starts, another leading indicator. That is something that economists look at to see what might happen in the future with the economy. So if people aren't buying homes or new homes are not being built, that means the things that go in those homes are not being purchased. So that's why that's a big deal.
Yep.
So you're not buying new furniture and new appliances and all that stuff. And construction workers aren't constructing. And
that's right. And the real estate agents aren't earning as much income, as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if my income goes down as a real estate agent, I buy fewer things. And if I buy fewer things, that person's income goes down. And, this kind of cycles through and multiplies in that way.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So the question then is, okay, so here we are with this inflation, and it looks like, well, let me ask you, how do you think the Fed is doing in terms of managing the inflation that we're experiencing?
I think they're doing a good job. So they're doing everything that they should be doing.
Okay.
Which is they fully, one of the main things that is important to bring inflation under control is for the Fed to really commit to doing it. So they've got to say that we're going to keep going until inflation is under control. And by doing that, they sort of assure people they can reset their expectations for what long-term inflation is going to be. And when that happens, that in itself can help bring down inflation.
Oh,
right?
really?
So part of what drives inflation is what I expect inflation to be.
All right.
Because that's going to drive, for workers, how much more we're looking for in our incomes. We want our incomes to keep up with inflation. Otherwise, effectively, our incomes are going down. We can't buy as much. And so all of those things and costs of other goods and services, we're basing our increases on what we think inflation is going to be. And so if the Federal Reserve in part can get those expectations down, we can already start to cool off the increases in prices. But people have to believe that the Fed is actually going to follow through. Now, why wouldn't they?
Yeah.
One of the issues with, as we said, they're raising interest rates to cool off the economy. If the economy cools off too much, then we're going to potentially enter a recession. Unemployment rate starts going up. That's when the Fed's commitment is really tested, whether or not they're going to continue bringing inflation down, or are they going to give up and focus more on the unemployment rate.
Now, one of the interesting things that's happening, so for you out there who are paying more for various goods and services, you go to the grocery store, you go to the gas station, you go wherever you go, things cost more. But one of the interesting things, Dr. Fuller, is that during this time, unemployment has gone down, and haven't wages kind of gone up? They just haven't gone up as much as inflation. So people just aren't feeling it because of inflation, right? But more people are working, making more, but their spending power is not as great because of inflation?
Yeah, that's right. Now, of course, this is going to depend on individuals.
Sure, right.
Parts,
yeah.
Some more.
Absolutely.
But when we look
speaking,
when we look at on average, wages have gone up a pretty good amount. I think roughly 5% or something like that over the past couple of years. And
unemployment is
unemployment
low.
Is way down. Yep, 3.5%, which is historically the lowest we've ever seen it since the 1950s, which was a different economy back then. And so on paper that looks great for workers, and 5% wage growth is awesome. It's just
if inflation
is 8%, that's still effectively 3% reduction in your actual purchasing power. So that's why you get this sentiment among some workers that it's maybe not going as well as what it would suggest looking at the unemployment rate.
Okay, so now we're in inflation, and I don't know if you put a percentage on it. How you say we're at X percent inflation rate or wherever we are, but wherever we are currently, doesn't matter. Is this where we're going to live once inflation kind of settles in a spot? Is that where we reside for the foreseeable future, or do prices go back down?
Yeah, that's a good question. So prices, unfortunately, won't go back down. So remember, inflation is the general increase in prices that's happening over time. And so what we're hoping to do is just to bring that increase down so that prices are increasing at a slower rate over time, but they're going to continue to increase from the level that they're at now.
Sure.
So if it costs me $5 for a dozen eggs, more or less for goods across the economy, it's going to continue to increase there, just hopefully much slower. And that we slow that down, then wages can catch up. And in terms of our purchasing power, it will feel like prices have gone down.
So, Dr. Fuller, prices are not going to go back down. Gee, I was hoping you didn't say that, but I guess I got to live with that. So then, let me ask this question before I ask that question that's in my head that nobody knows about. But let me ask this question. So the Federal Reserve, they're tinkering with all these things that they have manipulation over or control over, I should say. They're manipulating these things they have control over, one of which are interest rates. And it's a delicate balance. And you mentioned something called recession. What is recession? What's what they're doing, and what's the fear of recession in terms of what they're doing, and how does that relate to the economy and maybe going too far?
Sure. Yeah, good question. So a recession is basically when our economic activity is declining. Okay, so we typically measure our economic activity by how many total goods and services we produce in our economy. And we measure that with a thing called GDP, gross domestic product. So that name of it doesn't really matter. Mm-hmm. It tells us how much stuff did we make as an economy.
Okay.
And when the economy is growing, we're making more stuff.
Yep.
A recession happens when we're making less stuff. So economic activity is declining.
And typically that's because it costs more to make that stuff. Maybe?
It can be. Yeah, that can certainly be one cause of it. And that's probably a good topic for a long conversation. What causes the recession?
Okay.
But that can happen. That happened in the 1970s, for example, with the price of oil went way up. That sort of pushed the economy into a recession. So recession, economic activity is declining, and what that means for us is that the unemployment rate is going to tend to increase. So unemployment is going to go up. More people are going to lose their jobs. It's going to be harder to find a new job, and so you have people not earning income, and that's where it becomes difficult for us as households and consumers. So I think the second part of your question was, the balancing act that the Federal Reserve has to play there is that as they cool the economy off, raising interest rates, if they go too far, then we can actually push the economy into recession, unemployment rate going up, and then people aren't particularly happy. So that happened. The Federal Reserve did that in the 1980s, early 1980s. So if you're an econ nerd out there, you remember Paul Volcker, who was the chairperson of the Federal Reserve Bank at that point in time. And at the time, he was not very popular because he kept the actions to reduce inflation going, even though the economy was into recession, and it was generally accepted that was making the recession worse. And it was a pretty deep recession, unemployment rate around 10% at that point in time. And so that's where people are nervous as we wade into this in the future. If the Federal Reserve continues to pull back on inflation, are they going to continue to go so hard that we enter into a recession? And then if we do they continue fighting inflation, or do they kind of give up and try to give us some relief?
Now, I got a couple questions. One is, are these things that just naturally happen during an economy? I mean, are these cycles that we are always going to experience in the economy? There's always going to be a period of inflation. There's always going to be a period of recession. Or are the things that are happening that cause these things to occur?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty naturally occurring cycles, right?
Okay.
So the economy goes up and down. It has since we've been able to measure it. Inflation is going to move up and down as the economy is moving around. And, are there things causing those? Yes, but they're just a natural functioning of the economy.
Which then brings to my next question, which you don't always hear in reporting or when you're reading about inflation, that there may not be a lot that a politician or an elected official can do about it. These are just things that happen. I mean, sure, they might do something to make you feel better, but there's not a lot that an elected official really can do. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, there's really not much. Yeah, not on the side of politicians, right? Because it's inflation isn't something that a politician can control. There's no government policies or laws that are contributing to inflation. We talked about what was causing inflation. Those are things that are happening in the economy that a politician can't change. And in fact, when I teach about inflation, one of the costs of inflation I mention is that you can get sort of counterproductive policies that come from politicians trying to help. And they're well-intentioned, right?
Sure.
People are upset. The cost of goods and services are going up. I'm complaining to my representatives. They feel obligated to try something, and so they do something like, I'm going to put a price control in, right? So if the price of gas is going up too fast, I'm going to say it can't go up anymore. You can't charge more than this for gas. We tried that in the 1970s, and it was effective at reducing the increase in the price of gas, but it caused huge gas shortages because these mechanisms work in the economy whether we want them to or not. If we try to make them not work, we just make it worse. And so that's where I say I get nervous when you have high inflation because politicians want to do something. And if they try to, it's usually going to make everything worse than if they let the Federal Reserve do what they have to do to control inflation. And we just have to sort of bide our time and deal with these natural ups and downs.
And the Federal Reserve, who is this wizard behind the curtain? These are not political positions necessarily, although they may be appointed by a president. They are specifically apolitical. They're not elected of people. We don't even know many times who they are. We typically know the name of the chairman, but there are many people on the Federal Reserve, right?
Yeah, that's right. The Federal Reserve, so Federal Reserve system, it's a regional, so there's like 12 regional Federal Reserve banks that, so our closest Federal Reserve bank is in Chicago. We have one in Minneapolis. So those banks are in charge, Federal Reserve banks are in charge of kind of regulating and helping the banking systems of those areas run efficiently. So there's one part that the Fed does, which is just to manage the banking system.
These 12 banks aren't like Chase Bank, but they're banks over banks.
Yeah, it's like a bank for banks, basically, right? Yeah. And so you're right, but no one that works at those is a political person in any way, shape, or form. The Federal Reserve doesn't take any tax revenue from the government. They're functioning wholly on their own. So they make revenues and have costs like any other business in the economy. It's different than Chase Bank, but you can think of it like Chase Bank in terms of where it fits in politically. So some of the people are appointed by the president on the board of governors, but otherwise their terms tend to span longer than the term of the president. And so there's very little political control in the Federal Reserve Bank. And that is set up.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, that's set up by design to avoid politics getting into the decisions the Fed makes, because obviously if we want to fight inflation, that's going to tend to mean the economy's going to slow down, and politicians usually don't like the economy to slow down. So
then they get more calls from angry constituents.
They get more calls. That's right. Yeah. So the Federal Reserve is for the most part independent of Congress.
Okay. So last question. So this inflation that we're all experiencing, the higher cost of certain goods. Well, maybe not the last question. I just thought of another. First question I wanted to ask is, do businesses, when they are in these types of periods and they see prices going up, across the board, even though it may not be affecting their good or service? Do they increase prices as well? Do you think that happens and there are just some industries, some things that are going up for no good reason?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, so one of the things that you talk about, don't want to get too far into the weeds in economics, but we talk about, if we think about one good or service, we talk about elasticity of demand.
Yes, right.
So what that means really is just how sensitive are the people buying that good or service to changes in the prices.
So if I'm paying, so the elasticity of cooking oil may not be the same as the elasticity of a new computer.
Yeah.
That is that I need that cooking oil. So the elasticity for me is going to be a lot different. That is my decision whether I'm going to continue to buy it when I might not want to buy it. I'm still going to buy it because I need it. I might hold off on another price, another good or service, because the elasticity is different. That is my feeling about the price change may take me away from buying that and say, I don't want, that's not in my budget. I'm not going to do that.
Yeah, that's right. So, a good example of something that's what we call inelastic would be gasoline, right? So you buy gas for your car, you've got to drive back and forth to work. The price of gas goes up. You just pay more for the gas that you're putting in your car, right? So that I'm not very sensitive to the change in that price.
Yeah.
Cooking oil is another example, right? I've got to have it. The price goes up. There's not much I can do. And so if I'm a business producing a good that has relatively inelastic demand, that gives me a bit more freedom to increase the price and not suffer a big reduction in quantity. And so, in a perfect world, there's lots of competition, and a business isn't able to do that because if I raise my price, then somebody else will keep it low and they'll take all my business away, and we don't get into any problems. But unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. Some industries and some businesses are more competitive than others. And if you're in a relatively low competition environment or you have a lot of market power like in Amazon, then you can raise prices faster than the cost of the goods and services that you're using to produce those.
Last question for you. What is this? Are we in this inflation? Is it severe, mild kind of inflation? And how will we know? How will a consumer, how will the person out there listening to us know when inflation has plateaued?
Yeah, good question. So, and I'm sure no one will be agree with me when I say this, but the current inflation is still relatively mild.
Yeah.
So
well, if you lived in the 70s, you know
much worse. Yeah. And even other countries in different periods of time have had inflation rates well over 100%, for example. So
wow. That's incredible.
That's real inflation that has a big impact. So we're relatively lucky in that sense, but that said, it still is higher than what we're used to. And so that has an impact on us, and we certainly feel that. So how will we know when inflation has come down? So I'll offer two answers. One is the Federal Reserve will stop raising interest rates and we'll start cutting interest rates. So if I see that happen,
all right.
If I see the Federal Reserve no longer raising the interest rates or even cutting the interest rate, I'll know
good.
at that point that inflation is under control. They're confident inflation is under control. And so then, the only other way that we're going to notice is simply that things feel cheaper, meaning, at the end of the month, I've bought the things I'm normally buying and I've got more cash in the bank account than what I had in previous months. So that'll be the one sign that inflation has kind of started to go down.
Okay. Wow. We could talk about this for years. And that's probably why you lecture on it, because there's always something to talk about. Wow. But thanks so much for coming by and talking to us today. It's really been enriching and educational. And our goal here today was to kind of bring inflation into the living room of people so they get an understanding of what it actually is, why it is affecting them in the way it is, and how the Federal Reserve is trying to minimize that effect on them. And I think you've come in and done a great job to help explain that. So thanks very much.
All right. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Okay. You've been listening to UWO Now. Remember, UWO Now is the place where you can listen to interesting and relevant topics explained by subject matter experts at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. We also talk to administrators, students, and staff here, as well as alumni. So remember to keep checking us out. To hear the latest episode of UWO Now on our website, go to wrst.org. You can also go to podcasting platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and watch us, as I mentioned, on the UWO YouTube page. I'm Wendell Ray. Thanks so much for listening.